We now move on to session 2 of the forum to help us picture the future-facing senior workers in Singapore. We will have 2 presentations which are followed by an open discussion. The first speaker is Mr. Christopher Gee, who is a Senior Research Fellow at IPS. He will provide a comparative analysis of how advanced economies have managed policies related to older workers. The second speaker is Ms. Tien Yi Lin, who is Senior Partner at McKinsey and Managing Partner at McKinsey Singapore. She will share with us how emerging technological developments can provide opportunities for older workers to remain employable. To moderate the session, we are privileged to have Dr. John Lee, Chief Executive Officer of Maybank Singapore. Maybank has received several accolades for its progressive employment practices. In particular, it was recognized for its age-inclusive policies through the Tripartite Alliance Award in 2018. So we'd like to invite the panelists onto the stage. It's over to you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I probably have the easiest job of just moderating the session. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, the Institute of Public Policy, for inviting me to moderate this second session, which entitles Picturing the Future. So as indicated, we have 2 speakers. We'll have Christopher Gee to share with us a comparative analysis of how other advanced economies have dealt with keeping senior workers employable and employed, and then followed by Ms. Tien Yi Lin, Senior Partner in McKinsey, which will highlight emerging technology developments can mean for positive things for senior workers and sustaining their employability. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes for the presentation. But before, if I pass the floor to them, allow me to maybe also paint the picture of the future too. I think the data was shared, but I thought I would re-emphasize firstly on demography. As some of you know, the age pyramid of Singapore citizen population has become more top-heavy over the decade. The number of citizens aged 65 and above will almost double between now to 2030, while the number of working-age citizens between age 20 to 64 will decline. As a result, there will be fewer working-age citizens to each citizen aged 65 and over. The ratio is said to will fall from 4.2 in 2018 to 2.4 in 2030. Second area is longevity. Singaporeans now will live longer than most other nationalities, according to the latest World Health statistics by World Health Organization. Ranked Singapore 3rd in the world for average life expectancy behind Japan and Switzerland. The 2018, the age longevity is known to be 83.4 years. In another study, it's say by 2040, Singapore will remain the 3rd in the world, according to a study by University of Washington, Institute of Health, Metrics and Evaluation. And they predict by 2040, Singaporeans will live up to 85.4 years, so it's almost a 2-year increase in terms of lifespan. Thanks. The third I just want to talk about is digitalization, which obviously Diane will share a little bit more. I read a recent article. We all know that digitalization is disrupting our life positively, and maybe some will argue also negatively, particularly with work displacement. A recent article I read about AI, or artificial intelligence, says the following. It says that AI will take over the following jobs, 10 jobs in the foreseeable future: sales and marketing research, insurance adjuster, security guards, truck drivers, consumer loan underwriters, financial and sports journalism or journalists, bookkeepers and financial analysts, fruit pickers, that's an interesting one, investment professionals, and the last one, which was also interesting, radiologists. So this is supposed to be a medical, the profession attached to that. However, they did say that AI will not be able to do the following: psychiatrists, therapists, medical caregivers, AI researcher engineers, so self-preservation, I guess, fiction writers, teachers, criminal defense attorney, computer scientists and engineers and scientists, and finally, which saving grace for me, managers. So if you can't do, manage, and your job will be preserved. So with that, let me first invite Christopher to take us through his presentation. Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, John. I'm Christopher Gee. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute, and I do longevity issues I research longevity issues at the Institute. And very glad this afternoon to have the opportunity to speak about Singapore's policies on older worker inclusion in comparison to some other advanced economies around the world. And you would have received some background materials, and my presentation today will draw out some of the key focal areas from that material, and we can discuss this as well as some of the other stuff that was in the bigger slide deck in our time afterwards. Mr. Lee Pak-shing earlier already showed you some statistics on Singapore's older workers, but I wanted to start with this chart. This chart shows the effective retirement age in Singapore, as well as the 36-country OECD country average. This statistic, average effective retirement age, is an estimate of the age at which older workers will withdraw from the labor force. So the age at which older workers will withdraw from the workforce. As you can see, in the OECD countries as well as in Singapore, this trend, this statistic, has been rising quite steadily over the course of the past 2 to 3 decades, and faster in Singapore's case. This is the result of positive and not so positive trends. One, people are living longer, healthier lives, and consequently, they're able to work longer. Also, the shift in the composition of work away from manual labor obviously helps this trend. But reforms in many other countries away from generous and fiscally unsustainable defined benefit pension schemes has, however, meant that many people in some of these other countries may need to continue to work longer to ensure that they have enough to live on in their extended longevity. And we're not immune from this trend in Singapore, as we have this older group of workers, older persons who have not been able to accumulate enough retirement savings. The comparison with other countries in terms of our older worker policies. And there are a few things that I'd like to point out in this table. But firstly, a caveat. There's no simple study of this nature that can properly compare different countries' policies on older workers. There's differences in social, economic, political contexts of each country that determine these policies, and they all need to be understood in full. And what's right in one country may not necessarily apply fully in another country. But the most important matter, I think, to highlight in this slide, in this table, is the concept of retirement and the concept of the retirement age, which differs across the different jurisdictions that we have presented here. In many countries, the concept of retirement, the retirement age, is framed almost like a ceiling. It is that age that you will work until you become entitled to a pension, to draw down your pension, a zero or first pillar pension. And in Singapore, we don't have this concept. In Singapore, we have the Retirement and Employment Act, which Mr. Lee already taken you through. The concept of retirement in our context is a minimum age below which employees are protected from unfair dismissal on the grounds of age. Therefore, whilst we don't have specific age discrimination legislation as in other countries, like the UK, US, and many other European countries, the Retirement and Reemployment Act performs a similar function as an anti-age discrimination legislation in the workplace up to the age of 62. We've scanned the comparative data on metrics associated with older workers, and we find a number of areas in which Singapore's policies obviously have some room for improvement. They all seem consonant with some of the key themes arising from the engagement exercises that Mr. Vikas Sharma presented on just now. They are our policies which reflect the capacity of older workers to continue working. Our part-time work and flexible work arrangements, and fourthly, training participation amongst older workers and their ability to match them with the right suitable jobs for their upgraded skills. So for the rest of the presentation, I will dive deeper into these areas of improvement along three main lines. Firstly, enabling older workers to continue working as long as they want. Secondly, promoting the workability of older workers, and I choose to use that term, workability, as opposed to employability. There's a small difference, but workability will come a little bit more distinct as we talk through some of my slides later. And then thirdly, encouraging employers to retain and hire older workers. Again, not dissimilar to some of the things that Mr. Sharma was talking about earlier. So to start with, we have this progressive regime of retirement and re-employment, as we've heard from our speakers earlier. Our policies, however, are still established around some chronological age milestones that link age with workability and willingness to work. For example, 55. This age is the age beyond which CPF contribution rates start to taper down for both employers and employees. And it's also the age at which CPF members with the full retirement sum or the basic retirement sum with the property pledge can withdraw their excess balances. Next, we have 62, as again you have heard, the statutory minimum age of retirement. Although this is not a ceiling, many people still consider this a milestone, as re-employment discussions are typically triggered just before this age. 65, as you all know, is the CPF withdrawal eligibility age, and also until recently our re-employment age, now 67. 67 then is our new ceiling, our current ceiling for re-employment of older workers. Some countries like Sweden, however, and Denmark, have moved or are moving to a more dynamic threshold for their retirement and pension eligibility. And they're linking this to life expectancy. So to better reflect Singaporeans living longer, healthier lives, why not consider shifting to a more effective measure of their productive potential? We could link this, as the Swedes and the Danes do, have done, to a measure like life expectancy, but I think we can do better. We have a proxy for health span, the number of years that people will live in a healthy state. This is called the health-adjusted life expectancy, as Mr. Lee pointed out earlier. This was 72 for Singaporean males in 2012, 75 for women. By moving to a measure like this, we could better reflect Singaporeans' ability to continue to work longer. Also, many of them will have desire to continue to work longer just to live fulfilling lives. And link this desire, the capacity to work longer, with a good measure of their productive potential. I calculate that if the health-adjusted life expectancy were to rise until 2030, as it has done over the past 2 decades, by 2030, we could have an extra 350,000 person years of additional healthy life years for Singaporeans aged 65 and above. This, so it's 350,000 person years of productive potential. This is equivalent to 12% of our current labor force. We touched on the subject of CPF contribution rates. They, we all know, taper down after the age of 55 so as to preserve older worker employability. But this is, again, arbitrary in nature. It's limited by a chronological age milestone. And again, I wonder whether we should consider how we can make this a little bit less age-anchored, a bit less mandated a driver of the total compensation of older workers, those over the age of 55, and instead shift this to a better measure of worker productivity over their lifespan. So, have proper conversations with workers in different industries to, again, discuss how we, keep their contributions, their total compensation matched with their productivity. Whilst Singapore doesn't do too badly in comparison to some OECD countries on the prevalence of older workers in part-time employment, clearly, as we've heard earlier as well, we can do better in comparison to countries like Netherlands and Denmark, UK, Japan. All of these countries have more 55 to 64-year-olds in part-time employment. But part-time work proposition is, the shift in particular, the transition from full-time to part-time work is quite a tricky thing. And in practice, this is quite hard to pull off. The statistics, some research from overseas has shown that it is, there's some asymmetry in the bargaining position of part-time workers in particular, and Conway and Sturgis showed that there's some exploitation amongst UK part-time workers in terms of their unpaid work. They're unpaid, not paying for overtime work. We have in Singapore education and enforcement of the part-time worker protections under work right, but it really still requires quite a bit of employer-employee cooperation to kind of think through the steps by which you could essentially transition from a full-time job to a part-time job. It involves job redesign, as we'll talk about later, and also new ways of supervising and managing part-time workers who have previously been in full-time employment. Flexible work arrangements. Singaporeans have said that they do prefer, workers of all ages say that they do prefer to work in a more flexible manner, but the stats shown, this is a study from Randstad Work Monitor early this last year, and it shows that actually the larger majority of Singaporean workers still work in a very traditional manner as compared to their preferences. And again, the same statistic, again, in comparison to other countries, we rank higher in terms of the proportion of employees who would prefer to work from home or some other location, but their current job doesn't allow them the flexibility to do so. And whilst we do have arrangements to encourage employers to offer flexible work arrangements, there's as of early last year, a relatively low take-up rate for these incentives. The experience in other countries is may be instructive. Denmark, Iceland allow employees to shorten work hours. In Denmark, in particular, they have this idea of the senior job concept, where it's a bit more of a norm for workers, older workers, to negotiate shorter work hours or more flexible work arrangements. And moving on to skills training, the Singapore landscape for worker training at all ages has clearly improved in the last few years. Skills Future, a lot of the initiatives that we've seen in worker training across all ages has come through. I won't go through all of this in detail in the interest of time. But what we do find is that older worker participation in training is still markedly lower than in many of the other advanced economies. And some of this might be generationally dependent. Mr. Sharma, again, earlier mentioned this idea that workers with only a limited time before they retire may not have that much incentive to reinvest in their own human capital. But we do find, again, examples of some quite interesting initiatives across the globe. Denmark's got this job rotation scheme where the government subsidizes and finds alternative employees to cover those workers that have gone for training. And in the Netherlands, they have this ervaring certificate. I'm not sure whether I pronounced that right, but it's certification of the new skills that the workers have now obtained. I won't go through some of this, but maybe focus on Japan's senior work program. And I think the key thing amongst this is the idea that there is an element of matching contained within this senior work program, so that the program allows for the workers to be matched up with business associations and potential employers. In Singapore, we've got heaps of job redesign grants. And again, in comparison to other countries where job redesign is a little bit more based on encouragement by the government, in Singapore we have these grants under the WorkPro scheme. But again, I just want to focus on this workability model. In the reminder to attend this event, you were sent a link to participate in this survey. And this is a model adopted primarily in Finland, came out of Finland in the first place, and also in Australia. And it really intends to recognize the social and environmental factors that impact on a worker's ability to continue working. And it's not necessarily designed just for older workers, it's for workers of all ages, I think. And it considers 4 key factors that contribute to this workability. And you see them there: work, values, competence, and health. And again, if you did the exercise, the instrument is there. If you didn't do it, you can still take the workability index and check it out for yourselves. But here are some of the scores that we received, and you see this range. The lowest score is 7. The highest score is 49. But this instrument is designed to give you some indication as to how much support each individual worker may need in terms of sustaining their capacity to continue working. But it will also help HR. It will also help companies, employers, to identify teams where you need this job redesign, you need these new initiatives to sustain not just the individual worker, but also their groups, their teams, that you can restructure your business in its entirety to improve not just the lot of the worker, but also the business as a whole. So I'll end here. My time's up. These are the points that I think we should be thinking about. We clearly need to balance the interests of both employees and employers. It's clearly a tripartite, including the government, environment. We did make some proposals with respect to flexibility in terms of thinking about fixed retirement ages and reemployment ages. We talked about flexible work arrangements, including part-time work, job matching and the assessment of workability, and job redesign and how we can achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Diane?
Good afternoon. Thank you. Now, I'm going to start where John started, the future of work. Now, whenever you talk or read anything about the future of work or articles, etc., you end up with a very apocalyptic answer, that machines will take over the world and therefore there's no reason for us to exist anymore, right? And John started to reel off some of the occupations that will basically cease to exist, right? What my colleagues in the McKinsey Global Institute have done is actually do a bottom-up analysis and try and dispel some of this, right? Because when you take jobs and you break them down into activities, activities can actually be replaced by technology, be it automation or AI, but what we found was it's actually very hard to replace an entire job wholesale, right? So that's the first message I'd like to leave us with. So when we put up charts like this, that we say, here are the sectors that have an automation potential, it means that activities within that sector have the potential to be automated. And you'll see, in some cases, it is significant. And as John was saying, if you are a teacher in the educational services, it's less so, right? Now, this is a very macro view. Then we look at the jobs underlying it. About 60% of jobs we've identified, actually 1/3 of the activities can actually be automated. You'll be pleased to know, John, as a CEO, about 1/3 of your role can actually be potentially automated. By the way, most of us, when we break down those activities, are actually quite pleased because it's the really grindy, boring stuff, right? That we didn't want to do, that we'd be happy if a machine did for us, and then I can redeploy my time elsewhere, right? So the first misnomer that I wanted to correct is there are very few jobs that can be eliminated. Very few, right? There are some which actually over the years have started to be reduced anyway. In the agricultural space, a colleague of mine likes to tell the story, today no one will ever see an ad to be a telephone operator because that went out a long time ago, right? But very few jobs can wholeheartedly be replaced. And by the way, this is not a new phenomenon. This has been going on in time since the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so first thing is, very few jobs can be completely replaced. Secondly, all this analysis is done on technological potential, right? There's a lot of smart people matching activities with technology. When you look at behavior and adoption rates, it changes this picture quite considerably, right? So while technically you can have a certain amount of activities replaced by, let's say, 2050, we expect it'll probably take twice as long because it takes time and cost to get these technologies to be deployed, right? Now, I'd like everyone to just look at the bottom left-hand corner as well. There will be adoption of some of these new technologies, but I'd like us to view that positively, particularly as we talk about older workers. These are all the painful things that often are manual or physical that a machine or a technology can now help with. And actually the biggest beneficiary of this is often the older worker, right? So that's the first thing around the future of work, right? So this apocalyptic sci-fi world of robots all turning up, will remain in sci-fi land for a little bit longer. A more helpful way that we'd like to suggest we look at the future of work is less about automation and technology, about skills. And I've chosen skills also because skills irrespective of age, right? And we've done analysis, we've taken different categories of skills, we've broken them down across a whole set of this. And I think this is interesting. If we look at the skill categories, over time, what types of skills will become less important and what types of skills will become more important? This is where we go back to John's list, right? So things which are physical and manual, some robots can do. The good news is, by the way, robots have very bad fine motor skills. So there's still a lot of physical and manual fine motor skills that robots cannot replace. Basic cognitive skills. So this is problem solving, critical thinking, right? Yes, a little bit more kind of basic stuff. The higher cognitive skills, this was what John was talking about. How do I take 3 pieces of information that don't perfectly make sense and make a decision around that. How do I make a management decision around that? That's hard. A machine's not going to help you do that. You'll see a massive increase on social and emotional skills. The one triumph of the human type over the machine, right? This is your therapist. These are healthcare workers. These are teachers. These, by the way, are your colleagues and team players who help you through tough times, right? And of course, the last is, as we all have from the day we started P1, we all also will have to build our technological skills. And it's expected that we would see a huge leap there, right? And if you start then to say, let me look at the sectors where automation is possible, but let me add where are the skills that are needed in that. There will be some sectors where we will see more jobs, and there will be other sectors where there will be less jobs, right? So not a surprise, some of the very routine, repetitive, more manual, you'll see a decline, but a massive increase in technology professional, care providers, etc. By the way, if you are a parent whose child is taking PSLE or O-levels, this is normally the page you want to take so that you can tell your kid which courses to sign up for in university to increase likelihood of a job. This is the most common question I get asked. By the way, the answer to what is the highest growing job category is unfortunately other. We actually don't know. There are jobs that your children will do in the future that you cannot even begin to imagine because they don't exist today, right? So that's the future of work, right? So that apocalyptic world, let's put it aside. It's a much more nuanced world that we are up against. And let's talk a little bit about the aging workforce, right? How do they fit into this? We talked a little bit about the different types of skills. This is just a different cut, some of which are more needed, some less needed. We've broken them down, and you can look at all the different sub-skills within it and where do you need humans, etc. I wanted to pause here a little bit because we've all had to experience this. We used to have a lot of focus on technical or hard skills, but we expect that in time, when you're training for skills, we're going to overvalue more meta skills, so the ability to learn, lifelong learning, softer human skills around creativity, interaction, EQ. And the reality is, the average person joining the workforce today will likely have to reskill anywhere from 2 to 4 times on the technical knowledge, because we are working in a world that is changing, right? So if you are an educator, we want to be educating on meta and soft skills, because to be honest, the rest you will learn how to use Google and figure out, right? Now, back to our slightly older workers, right? What are some of the traits? And this is a little bit of a survey of some of our clients across the world. I think we often forget, and in some of the research, people focus a lot on all the things that older workers cannot do. Let's focus on what older workers are better at, right? Because with age and experience, a couple of things come your way, right? Number one is, much more focused, a bigger sense of loyalty, and in today's world, when you're up against millennials who are looking for their next job when they start day one on one job, that becomes much more highly valued. A very strong work ethic, right? Networks, because remember again, back to this stronger EQ skills, the ability to understand networks and interpersonal skills, build relationships, right? And lastly, with experience, of course, the ability to mentor and to teach and to share their knowledge, right? What I wanted to do then was to say, where can we draw some inspiration from? Right? And I've just picked 3 examples from companies across the world who've really embraced the older worker, right? What we have found, if we poll any CEO today, 3 out of 4 of them will tell me that talent and the scarcity of talent is my number one problem. 1 out of 4 will say that's my number 2 problem, right? So let's start with that frame. An example that you wouldn't kind of immediately come to mind, Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, the ultimate kind of, in investment bankers, not particularly kind of, you don't think about an inclusive working environment, right? But in a world where talent is scarce, right? What have they done? They've actually gone back to their pool of sometimes alumni, often people who've left the workplace and brought them back, right? A large proportion of this, just nature of the industry, have actually been skewed towards women, right? Who have tended to opt out of the, the slightly more intense work environment. So they started a returnship program, right? A way to get older, more mature workers back in, right? Now, it'd be naive of them to say, oh, just come back, it'll be all good, we'll give you a machine off to work, right? To the point which I think other speakers have talked about, it does require a little bit of reskilling, right? And it's in the interest of employers to do some of that reskilling. It is incumbent upon the worker coming in to be open to some of that reskilling. And actually, they've had great success with this, right? That's one example. I pulled it out for not somewhere where you would have thought inclusive work environment. Second one, CVS. For those of you who don't know, this is a US healthcare company. They're known for their retail pharmacy chains. They actually took the older worker as a strength. They actually had, at this time, this case study was written maybe a year and a half ago now, that half of their full-time employees were over 50, right? But remember, these guys are in the healthcare space. How do I use that as a strength? Because if I look at the demographics, my consumers are matching the same demographic pattern. How do I use the fact that I want to actually increase my proportion of older workers because they will be an asset for me against a matching consumer base, right? So very similarly, they took very specific actions to how do I now find these workers, recruit them, train, etc., right? And that has worked very well for them as well. Then I thought we'd be remiss if we didn't look at a manufacturing example, right? BMW, they actually did this. They actually had one of their production lines start with older workers. When they ran that line versus a standard sort of production line, the line with older workers actually was less productive. What did they do? They said to the workers, tell me how I help you, right? How do I create a work environment that enables you to be productive? This is job redesign, right? So they actually had the employees do the job redesign for themselves, right? Because they know where the pain points are. They were able to make suggestions on what support they needed. And as a result of that, they'll find that they can perform as well as any other worker. And here now, they've got the benefits that we talked about of an older worker, right? More loyal, more experienced, and as productive, right? So just 3 examples for, otherwise, we're in the world of theory of, yes, we'd like it, but actually, there are companies doing it out there. Why are they doing that? Not because they're, good intention, wonderful policy makers for the good of the world. It's an economic and business imperative. Talent is scarce. And if you aren't proactive about this, someone else will be. And you'll lose out, right? So this concept that if we do believe that talent is scarce, how do we, from a mindset and practices perspective, take advantage and really leverage the segment of older workers? And you've seen some examples here. The last I wanted to leave you with was Generations is McKinsey's non-profit initiative. They actually work in partnership with SkillsFuture here in Singapore. And they have a very simple objective. How do I help reskill? And we've got now programs running across, I think, the US, Spain, 2 countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and now here in Singapore, whereby we've partnered with education providers, with employers, with government, in this case Skills Future, and with individual employees over a period of sometimes as short as 6 weeks, usually closer to 12 or 18 weeks, to take cohorts of current workers and reskill them, right? Often for new technology, so data scientists, digital marketing, things like that, right? So, we've talked a lot about 2 things which I think are recurring themes around the need for job redesign, which actually we've seen is possible. The second around reskilling, which of course will have to come hand in hand, which we also think is possible. So let me leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. Before I open up for some discussion around this topic, I'm sure not all of you have seen it, then you must see the movie called The Intern. Robert De Niro being the older worker and Anne Hathaway working in this new world. And the dynamics of the 2 individuals, develop over the movie. And I think that's really what the future, to me, is. It's the fact that I think we can no longer look at work, jobs, in the manner that we have looked in the past. I think that's really some of the discussion we need to have. So maybe before I open the floor for discussion, if I could maybe kickstart the discussion by asking the 2 individuals. The first questions. There are microphones, so as you frame your questions for the individuals, please, when you come up, state your name and then your question. But let me kickstart by asking this question. Following from the 2 presentations, it's clear, as I said, what we probably need to discuss is what are the challenges and issues that need to be discussed to allow for longer and older employability. So, we talk about jobs and all that, but really, are we framing the issues and therefore discussing those issues appropriately? Maybe I'll get Christopher to start off.
So it's, as we've already discussed, it's not an easy task. The rapid nature of Singapore's workforce and population aging, does present us with a particular challenge. Society takes a while to adjust to this transition. We've become accustomed to the 3-stage life cycle, right? So you study, you go into work, and then you retire. And it's seen as a marker of success if you can control your timing into these different life stages. And we valorize this whole idea of a comfortable retirement, long, happy retirement. But the reality is a bit more complex than that. And as we've heard again earlier on in our session already thus far, it's the actual practical transition into retirement and not working, or working in a different way, or working productively but unpaid, right? So there's a whole spectrum of preferences. There's a whole spectrum of capabilities that need to be catered for. It's not easy, and you need to go on the front line. Researchers like myself, find it easy to say, the headline things, but actually, it's really hard and painstaking, the work that needs to be done, because it's individual by individual, employer by employer, and society at large has to pull together. But if I had to say one thing, I think we really need to move away from these chronological age markers, these fixed ages where we say you're young, and then you're no longer young, you're old, right? So I think, if I had to think of only one thing, we've got to be a bit more flexible in the way we define ourselves as young, not so young, and old.
John, I think we have in many ways talked a lot about the issues, right? As Christopher has started to say, some of this is societal and quite entrenched, right? So I do think that the mindset issue, be it at an employee, employer, and society, is probably the most difficult to break, right? Because we all do have expectations of what one is expected to do. We have expectations of what counts as success, right? And therefore, you know, we've set ourselves up for that path, right? So I do agree with where Christopher is going. And I think we do need to reframe the discussion and change the expectation that we will have phases of life linked to skills and new skills, as opposed to a chronological, I start A, B, C, D, E, right? So, and that's kind of where I'd like to shift the world towards, right?
So actually, just on that, you know, just talking about new jobs and all that, if you wouldn't be surprised if you ask some of the young people what some of the jobs that they like to do. And this, to me, was a revelation a few months ago when I asked that, is to be an e-gamer. Right? So the job never existed in the past, but now you can actually be an e-gamer and make a lot of money from it. So just to give a perspective of how jobs have changed. Any question from the floor? If not, I've got a few other questions, but I thought I'll open up. Please, the gentleman. Please state your name and your question. Is it on? Someone, maybe?
Yes.
Is this on?
Yep,
We on?
that's on, yeah.
I'm a nobody, but Happy New Year, everybody. I was a bit concerned at the beginning of the presentation by the MOM and the consultant, because it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the bias from MOM is a very dangerous bias in the new world. Huh? But I was very happy to listen to Chris and, should I call you Deanne?
Yes, that's fine. Or DY.
DY. Extremely positive and highly geared towards the future, not the past. You see, I have a simple suggestion to MOM. The mindset got to be changed. The government's mindset got to be changed. You should not call yourself MOM anymore, because you say manpower. Basically, it's man and power, right? Lifting power. You should call yourself, I was thinking of MOT for talent, but then I said I had to compete with transport. So I say MOR, Ministry of Resources, because Singapore may be short of natural resources, no oil, no gas, nothing, right? But if we know how to develop the best resource on earth, human resources, we're on to something good, yeah? So I think MOM may really want to think about it.
Maybe could I get asked for your question? Yeah.
Now, the future is already here, and it was here early on. I give a very simple example. All the presentation, there's one group of people completely missed out: the designer, the creative people, the architects. Now, I give you an example of 3 architects. Lou Kahn never designed a building until he was 61. And he built some of the best buildings on earth in America, okay? Well, closer to home, Jeffrey Bauer was a successful lawyer. He gave up. He went to architecture school when he was 50. He's the best architect of Sri Lanka in the history of Sri Lanka, right? And the third one, some of you may be familiar with Falling Water, the famous house, right? Now, the story is that Wright designed the building in one morning at the age of late 70s. Well, there are 2 ways to look at it. He actually got his people to draw the design in one morning.
Sorry, I really want to get...
No. So what I'm saying is basically is that the future is not in manpower, the productivity. The future is in creativity and capabilities, employability, not employment. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't think there's a question there, so... Gentlemen, yes, please.
John Elliott, I would like to say I appreciate very much Christopher Gee's emphasis on flexibility, because it has long seemed to me obvious that age is just a proxy for other things. It's a proxy for health. It's a proxy for intellectual ability or for physical strength. So you need to have different ages at which different employments become incapable of continuing, and retraining or change of work is necessary. But I noticed that, Devan, you, in your second example, you mentioned, I think it was CVS, had no mandatory retirement age. Now, I like the idea of no mandatory retirement age. I like the idea that nobody should ever be able to say to you, at this age, you have to stop working. We don't care how competent you are, you have to stop. But it brings a great difficulty, as I see it, which is that you have to tell people who can't do the job, you can't do the job. And I wonder if you could enlighten us as to how you approach the problem of telling workers, employees, that they are not actually able to continue if you don't have a mandatory retirement age. Because I'd like to see this no mandatory retirement age, but it has that problem. Could you comment on that, please?
I'm happy to take that. Let me use McKinsey as an example, right? As many of you know, we have an up or out policy. One of probably the toughest performance environments for a corporate, right? Where if you are no longer performing, you are expected to leave, right? Which most people think is incredibly mean and harsh. But actually, it's one of our core values, and one which we think makes us quite special, and one that our firm members actually hold very dear to. Because when we say you are not up to a particular job, it does not mean you are not up to any job. And I think that's important, right? And what at least I have seen we've started to do, and more successful companies have do, is to think about which components of a job are you capable of doing? How do we play to your strengths and leverage those strengths? In some cases, move you to roles. In some cases, move you to other roles in other firms, etc. And focus on building that as opposed to all the things that you are not able to do. Now, to be very specific to your question, you can only do this if you have an open culture of feedback, of transparency, and an objective way to measure performance, right? So some of those are enablers which do need to be in place, and a culture of honesty and caring to say, you don't enjoy this, you're clearly unhappy here, it is not playing to your skills, let us find you something that will.
Chris.
Yep. And again, I'd like to just point everybody to that workability index. You know, that's a starting point in the discussions that employers and employees should be having regularly throughout their working time. And that gives you a guide as to you know, the kind of the work capacity and the work desire of each individual worker. And then combined, you can get a sense, an early sign of potential problems, or where it's really swimmingly great. But where you might have creeping problems, you can then start to early identify individual workers or teams that you know, are finding it difficult to cope with the challenges of the tasks ahead of them. And do aggressive job redesign, and maybe reemploy them in other roles. So you know, I think having that kind of instrument or having that kind of capacity to understand what your workers are thinking about, what their capacities are, I think you know, it's the hard work that needs to be done. It's not easy, as I said earlier, but it needs to be done.
Any other questions from the floor? Maybe the gentleman in the front first.
Gerard E. I totally subscribe to what I've heard. My question to you is, how many corporations in Singapore have a HR department that can handle all this type of job, developing the appraisal system, understanding training? You go to most corporation, training means PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, but never relevant to the job that they are thinking about. So can we really solve the problem if we don't address the lack of HR capabilities?
I think the answer is quite obvious, in my opinion. And I think if I could, and before I let Chris and Dan comment, certainly in Maybank, as I said, we did have to put in the effort. It wasn't something that you just evolve into. It's something that you have to put in the effort. So age inclusiveness in our workplace practices have to be something that you want to adopt and therefore put things around it to make it happen. So I think there are efforts that employers need to make to say that we're going to want to do this. So you're totally right in that sense. In terms of how you include them, what kind of training, what kind of transition you want to make, all that needs to be thought through. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I think.
Sorry, the point I'm trying to make, employees as business owners obviously is interested, but won't have the knowledge or the skill set to address this issue, and neither do they have a HR department, or at least a proper HR department. So who is going to handle it? So should it be an agency, or MOM, or whoever it is that goes out to actually address the core of the issue, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. You know, the private sector, individual businesses, right? Should, it's hard to mollycoddle all of them to kind of, implement all of these far-sighted things, particularly at a time when everybody's rushed off their feet, right? We're just, also busy in our daily work, trying to keep up with the changes in the economy that many businesses, particularly small ones, just don't have that bandwidth, that time to kind of, do the things that are needed, as we've discussed already. But one example that I raised just now, the job rotation scheme in Denmark, may point to one mechanism by which we can do this. So collectively, we appreciate that this is a problem. We subsidize or we give grants and enable the capacity for employers to have a little bit of breathing room, right? So employ a temporary worker to cover for workers that need to do retraining, right? And have a scheme whereby you encourage, give businesses and employers that flex room, that capacity, that buffer, to just do the things that are necessary. Not easy.
Gerard, I think you've hit on an important point, right? If you allow market forces to play out, what would you expect? Employees vote with their feet, right? And we've seen that, right? You've seen the startups really where there is a lot more attention paid to the nature of a job, responsibility, pathway, etc., really pull talent from places where talent is not managed and nurtured, right? You will see C-suites evolve, right? We advocate what we call a G3, that you really need a CEO, a strategic CFO, which Singapore, I would argue, is quite good at, and a strategic, what we call CHRO, right? Because you need a combination of the three to really guide companies through today's very tumultuous, much more globalized world. Some companies have risen to that challenge, a lot more so, and I think you see it in the results, and others have not. And, market forces, I suspect, will prevail. I think it's, as many of the charts have shown, the policymakers here have actually offered more money than in most places in terms of grants and opportunities to support companies to do that, in terms of job redesign, training, etc., right? I think it becomes incumbent on companies to take advantage of that.
The lady, I think, had a question. Yeah, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Esther. I like the idea of the returnship, which is excellent. I just want to know that the Institute of Policy Studies, will they have these policies being implemented for the Singapore startup companies as one of the essentials to the point of retraining, returnship, and things like that for them before they can actually start a company. I guess maybe from the foundation of starting out a company to build in this culture, we'll be able to get older workers to continue working, because I understand also we have a gap where the younger millennials are not as faithful and loyal to the companies. Am I correct? So do they have such policies for the Singapore companies to build a culture?
So build a culture of employing
yes.
older.
Yeah,
I think that
the culture.
encouragement is there and the policies
Yes,
are there.
yes,
yeah?
yes.
So I think it's up to individual organization to see how they want to take that forward.
All right.
Yeah.
Working from a foreign company before, I noticed that every company, foreign company, they have their own very distinct culture. Like the Japanese, they have their own distinct culture. The Europeans and the American or the US. So if we can create this distinct culture in the Singaporean climate or companies, I think maybe we'll be able to continue this younger generation to the older generations in the continual workforce. That's my perspective.
Yeah. Right. Thank you for your input. Please.
Hi, this is Rosalind from TAFET. I just want to respond to Jared's question about, whether or not it's really important. I do agree that it's very important to have the skill sets, to have the resources, to have the toolkits to build age-inclusive workplaces. We at TAFET, we do provide that resources. There are many agencies who actually provide such support. Companies that are too small, who really have to concentrate on their businesses, who do not have proper HR and also expertise to do the work, there are also shared services that they can tap on. So in terms of the resources, where do you get it, where the assistance, where the advice, where the toolkits, etc., I think there will be people who are able to help, and TAFET will be such agency. We have a age-inclusive portal, lots of resources there. We also provide advice. We also work with companies. We are not the expert, but we do provide in terms of resources, where can you get help, consultancies, etc., share services, etc., to help you to go and build a age-inclusive workplace, because it's very important for us to really tap on the older workers. And TAFET, we also do a lot of encouragement. We have campaigns to sort of promote the value that older workers bring to a workplace, and how employers should tap on this pool of talent.
Thank you. Chris, you wanted to...
Just to follow on, and maybe I'll also address this to Rosalind. The idea here is, yes, there are a lot of schemes and programs, but as we've seen with the flexible work arrangements, the Work Pro scheme, take-up is not perhaps what we would desire, and the complaints still remain on the ground that it's really difficult, and this is not happening. So my question back to you, I guess, is, if I may, how do we go to the last mile? How do we actually go to the companies themselves, to each individual worker on the retraining front, right? How do we do that? And again, it's clearly I appreciate it's not easy. One of the things that I guess we can consider is, it's just, I apologize, it slipped my mind, but I think it's just the last mile that we really need to focus on. That would be the point I would make. Yep. And
may I suggest not to use this forum as a response? Maybe you all can have an offline conversation and have so this lady, please.
Kanwaljit Soin, former nominated member of parliament. I'd like to make 2 points. One is that more than, at least 1 in 3 of our workers is over the age of 50. And many people consider 50 as older workforce. So we are not talking of a minority. We are talking of 1/3 of our workforce that is over the age of 50. So it should be a pressing concern. It's not something, and younger workers need reskilling, so do workers over 50. So it's not a problem that is particular to older workers. To be brief, I'll go to my second point. In many countries, women often return to the workforce when children are older, and we have what's called the M-shaped labor force for women. But in Singapore, I think about 400,000 women of working age are outside the workforce, and this includes older women, because of caring responsibilities. So here, and that is tied not only with looking after older people, also with the education system and how children need to be looked after. So I think you have to have, this is not just pertaining to MOM, it has to pertain to how we provide care for older workers, older people, how we provide care for disabled, so we can free women, older women, to get back into the workforce. So it has to be a whole of government conversation and not let the poor MOM just handle it all on their shoulders.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? We got about 15 more minutes, or if not, we can, have an early break. Yes, please, that lady over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Kalyani Mehta, and I have an academic position. I'd like to ask how our forum here, together with the distinguished speakers, intend to increase the part-time flexible work arrangements in Singapore, because as Christopher pointed out, that's an area where we need to improve. So really, in terms of the outcome of having a forum today, I think perhaps we could ask the speakers now as well as later how the government can do this. And I totally echo what Kani said. It cannot be just the MOM. So it's got to be SNAF, it's got to be NTUC, it's got to be other bodies as well, universities and so on, working together to offer these opportunities, particularly for people who have been out of the workforce and would like to come back to the workforce. I would also like to know if anybody has any statistics on job sharing, because just from my observation, I think job sharing is not that popular here in Singapore. Somehow employers are not very comfortable with the idea of job sharing, but perhaps we could do more of that. I know in some countries it really works out quite well. One person consistently comes in the morning and one person consistently comes in the afternoon, and they take care of that job. So if there's any statistics, I'd like to see some of those. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. I think that's a very good point. And I think to Christopher's comment around the part-time employment, and I was just having a conversation with someone just this morning around the fact that, to the point of looking at your life not in 3 stages, in fact, between working and then retirement, there's a transition where you just work less, because it's not a binary thing, 0, 1, or 1, 0 in this case. I think something that should probably be taken. I don't think we have an answer today. It's probably something that we need to explore further as to how to make that more effective, and then so to speak. That's your. Yeah.
I would add just one thing. This question of flexible part-time freelance, right, is a theme that we're seeing globally across the world. in some markets it is a women issue, but in many markets it's really a millennial issue because people want flexibility. Some people have very specific skills that they want to deploy in a much more flexible manner. The one thing that we do see the beginnings of success for things like this to take off is online job platforms, right? And some of you who are, if you're in the freelance world, you will see today, even in Singapore, there are portals whereby, let's say project managers, for example, right, will say, actually, I want, to work on a project for X number of months, and then I'm kind of done, right? And we found that the use of some of these technologies where you can create a much more transparent marketplace between supply and demand has actually helped take off this concept. It allows flexibility. It allows companies, when they need niche-specific skills, to not to have to commit to kind of long-term employment. It allows companies also, as they go through kind of more disruptive moments in their time, to be able to kind of take on contract workers, etc. So that's one comment I just made.
I agree.
It's one thing.
I think in the case of Singapore, while people talk about the gig culture, right? People want to just do a certain task or do a certain
gig
job
economy.
and leave. I don't think that it's the economy is able to support that kind of culture in a holistic way. I think there's some work that needs to be done around that. Sorry, a gentleman in front had a question.
I'm Alex Melches from SNEF. In Tripartite, but actually in Singapore at large, we always had a balance between solving problems with legislation and sometimes with more promotional efforts, mindset change. When you look at the topics, the big topics that we are addressing right now here, and as we also have the Institute of Policy Studies, which are the areas where you say, like, here we need legislation, and which are the areas where you say, no, this, we don't want to have legislation here, we really need to work on more promotional effort in order to solve the problems. From the panel, where do you see the necessity to really force people into certain structures, or where do you say, like, here, we need to take a more flexible approach?
Yep. Again, the Institute of Policy Studies does quite a number of things. Again, I work on longevity, and this is clearly a very multifaceted issue. I'm not a HR practitioner, so I can't, I don't have the expertise to opine on the areas where I think you've touched upon, and many of the things that I really am not an expert in. However, I would say this. I think we can paint a lot of what we've discussed already and understand that what we have in Singapore is to some extent a generational issue. Many of our current older workers, those in their 60s and older, grew up in a very different Singapore. They had a very different educational trajectory and entry into the workforce. And all of that has meant that their life outcomes are very different to the cohort that is immediately after them. So, maybe the conditions for older workers, if we think about this in a dynamic way, can change. And I think, this is where I think we can isolate, some of our policies and say, well, okay, this pertains to today's generation of older workers, and we can have policies maybe even structured more in terms of welfare, something like the Pioneer Generation Package, to understand that they are that generation that just, missed out a little bit on Singapore's development, but actually have grounds for optimism and craft policies that are designed for the upcoming older worker, those in their 50s, 40s, that actually they have a different trajectory. And if we continue some of the initiatives that we've got and don't entrench ageist mindsets, I think that's quite a positive outcome. Already we've seen good results. Our average effective retirement age has been rising. There's no reason why that cannot continue with Singaporeans living longer and healthier.
Any one final question? If not, I will just, okay, only one final one. Ladies first, or lady comes first.
Ho Gyok Chu from Human Capital Singapore. Thank you very much for sharing at the conceptual level what we should be doing about the older workers. I thought it would be good if we can start thinking about the action piece, because at the end of the day, it's about how do we translate all these policies and thoughts that we have into actionable steps. And one of the observations that I have is that, in a way, all the big things are fragmenting into smaller pieces. So big organizations that we have been talking about in this era of transformation will probably be reshaping, restructuring into smaller outfits and entities. And the older generation that we are trying to bring back to the workforce or retain in the workforce will probably have to temper their aspirations with realism. The question really is, it is okay to dream, to have aspirations, but have we thought about putting in place some resilience training, some programs, or even some forums where we put in the employers or potential employers together with this group of people to have conversations so that they bring down the walls between them. You talk about last mile, I talk about the first mile. And I think the first mile is about that resilience in training, that sense of reality. I remember when I first started work, I started with Stat Board, then CISA, and then I went to United Overseas Bank. One of the big factors in all the performance appraisal forms that we have was this sense of reality. And when we tested candidates, I was in charge of recruitment, I remember. One of the things that we always tested amongst the candidates who came for interview was whether that individual has a sense of reality. And I think sense of reality has to, is something that is an attribute or is a value system that should be embedded in everybody, irrespective of your age group. You can't take that attitude or the mindset that it's somebody else's problem. It all begins with you. You taking that first step to want to be realistic about things around you and start to shape your own mindset. The rest can come in to give you the support. Thank you.
Nice. You just pretty much set the scene for the next topic, I think, shaping the future. So before we close, we have 3 more minutes. Any last remark? No more. Any last comment, remark from Diane?
I think if I just kind of recap perhaps some of the points I made, right, which is, number one, I do not think we are going into an apocalyptic world where machines will take over all our jobs. Second, I think it will boil down to skills and continuous reskilling for people of all ages, right? Job redesign will need to come in partnership with that skills training. And I am a believer that if everyone says talent is a true scarcity, then we should be optimistic because our older workers have some of the best experience, have some of the best attributes, and therefore companies should be very willing to bring them into their workforce.
Thank you. Christopher?
Message quite simple, really. The longevity payoff is huge. For individuals, this ability to work longer, it allows people to live longer but more fulfilled lives, and it leads to a huge improvement of welfare, not just for themselves, but also for their families. And this translates to a broader context, right? There's this untapped productive potential. If we don't tap it, it's lost. But if we do tap it, there's huge potential. It makes a huge difference to our support ratios, our dependency ratios at a national level. So the longevity payoff is huge. I think we need some examples I think we will get more, but you know, we'll need to take those hard steps, but small steps in the right direction will underpin the positive momentum.
Thanks, Chris. Allow me, as chairperson, to also maybe summarize and try to provide some suggestion. I have three. The first, I think, we can no longer use old solution for the problem we have today. I think, you know, what was relevant 10, 15 years ago, you know, that's at least, I mean, relevant, the solution may no longer be the solution for what we see going forward. So a new approach, a new thinking, a new discussion around that. Second, to me, we need to define jobs differently. I think jobs historically have been defined from a task point of view, what work you do, as opposed to what output you give. And if we move to that output driven, then the flexibility, I think, is easier. For example, you know, again, in Maybank, when we implemented the flexible work hours or flexible work environment, the challenge was around jobs that were task-orientated, because you had to do that job. You can't go on flexible hours because you have to do those jobs. But output-driven, outcome-driven, it was a lot easier. So we need to relook at that. And the final thing, if I could say, is around what Christopher talked about, is we need to look at life not in those three stages. Not only from work to retirement, but throughout our life. You know, skills, acquiring, learning, it's a lifelong thing. A question I asked in Singapore universities today, how many older, forget about workers, how many older students do you have? You know, you look at Western society, I think you'll find that the proportion of older people going back to school, it's actually quite high. Yeah? And there's always proud moments about them graduating with their children, and even some of them with their grandchildren. So I'll leave it at that. We'll run out of time. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Diane.